We've reached the final episode of the first season of your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes. We head back up north to Deward on the Manistee River, the last boomtown of Michigan's lumber industry. Settle in, sit back, and enjoy another episode of North Country History with Rob Berg. North Country History with Rob Berg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. Hello, this is Rob, and you're listening to the final episode of the first season of North Country History. Today, I'm bringing you Deward, the last of Michigan's lumber boomtowns. And we're actually on site of Deward recording this episode. It is the evening of October 3rd, 2024, and I'm sitting around a campfire on the site of historic Deward, Michigan. 120 years ago, I wouldn't be sitting here at a campfire. I would probably, being a single man, just down the way a little bit at the boarding house where many of the single male employees would have been living at while working at Deward. Deward was created with the death of lumberman David Ward. He was known by his peers as the Pine King because during his lifetime, working in Michigan from really the 1830s to 1900, or just shortly before his death and beginning of 1900, that he was one of the most successful lumbermen in Michigan. Today we call them lumber barons. It's usually considered a derogatory term because they were the ones who cut and ran. Once they logged off an area, they moved on to another location, didn't bother with maintaining that land, replanting the trees. Some were that, many were not. So I try to stay away from the lumber baron term. But David Ward certainly was one of the most powerful lumbermen in Michigan during his lifetime. He was born in New York, kind of around Keene, New York, in the Adirondack Mountains. And as a young man, or actually as a teen, he came with his father to Michigan, to what is now, south of Port Huron. I think it's now Marine City, but in that area, his family lived there, and he helped his father as a timber looker, going out into the forest looking for the standing timber, what would be good for cutting. And that was his entry into the lumber business here in Michigan. First helping his father in New York State, and then here in Michigan, and then going off on his own as an adult. And through one of the ways of his payment for looking for timber for other lumbermen was he was able to purchase some of the prime timberland. He would locate it for himself, and that built up a nice reserve of lumber for him, and he used that as his capital, as his reserve. Then that when he began cutting, he had the various land to cut the timber, standing timber that he had to be able to cut, and he became one of the wealthiest lumbermen in Michigan. He not only had various logging interests all throughout Michigan, started along on the Pine and Chippewa rivers between what's now Mount Pleasant and Alma, and down to Midland in that region. But he came north, looking for land along Otsego Lake area, and where a railroad was to be built through eventually. And he owned some of the land along through there, and that became kind of the core land that he started cutting, that he had here in the area where Deward is. It's where Crawford County, Otsego County, Kalkaska County, and Antrim County kind of all come together. And there were some scattered interests in lands in other areas up around by Charlevoix and then along up towards Petoskey as well. But the core area there, most of that remained untouched through his life. And it was in 1900 when he passed away that he had a stipulation in his will that his assets had to be liquidated within 12 years. So that meant his executors had to have this land, this forest cut within 12 years, so by 1912. So they began cutting this land. They decided to locate a central sawmill and a community surrounding that mill, and they called it Deward, David Ward, the initial and his last name. And over the years, it's been pronounced Deward, Deward, and it was the location for his sawmill, for this community. And it was where the last big boom town for logging, or last boom area for logging, took place in Michigan of the white pine lumber era. And as I mentioned, it was for 12 years. And the mill was located on the upper reaches of the Manistee River, but it was right close by to David Ward's personal railroad that he owned, called the Detroit and Charlevoix Railroad. And it connected the community of Frederick on the Michigan Central Railroad to the southeast of Deward in Crawford County. And it ran then up through to the Deward area, which Deward wasn't actually on the line, but they built a spur to it because they wanted to locate the sawmill in the best location, so they built the railroad to it. And it went then to East Jordan on the south arm of Lake Charlevoix. And then from there, they would take lumber on ships, on lumber schooners, on steamers, up Lake Charlevoix, and at Charlevoix enter into Lake Michigan and to markets to places like Chicago, or back around Lake Huron down to Detroit, or Cleveland, or Buffalo, New York. So this was where Deward would be located, and it was a bustling community for that 12 years. In 1912, the mill cut its last log, and it was shut down in March or April of 1912, and everybody was laid off, except for those that were needed to be employed to close up the mill and shut down the town. Everybody else started to move out. Now, some people stayed on for a while. The last residents left in the 1930s, but the town shut down, the post office closed, and most people moved on. David Ward was quite an interesting man. He was the eldest of his family, and along with working as a timber cruiser, he did numerous different things in his younger part of his life. He taught schools, he worked with his brothers as commercial fishermen, and he studied to be a doctor at the University of Michigan, one of the early medical students there in the 1830s. But yet he never practiced as a doctor. Ward's family was quite large and quite prominent, not his immediate family, but his extended family, his father's family. He had a number of brothers, and they all settled in Michigan, coming from Keene, New York, and settling in St. Clair County. And one of his uncles was a man named Samuel Ward. And Samuel Ward was quite wealthy, and he was mostly involved in shipping on the Great Lakes. He did have some interest in lumber, but then he also had a cousin by the name of Eber Ward. And Eber Ward became the heir to Samuel Ward because Samuel Ward had no children. And Eber Ward, who apparently did not care for his cousin David Ward, according to David Ward's autobiography, but Eber Ward, using his money, he not only was involved with shipping, but he also began the first Bessemer steel mill in Michigan, down around by Wyandotte, and became one of the early steel mill businesses in Michigan. That would help lead to quite a variety of industry in our state in the future, of course, including the automobile in that. But so David Ward was not the only successful member of the Ward family, though he was certainly the most important one in his branch of the family. He became very wealthy, as I mentioned, working mostly in lumber, and not just in Michigan, but he had interests in different parts of the country, like many of the lumbermen did, in the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia and along in that area. Then he was also in the South, Louisiana and Arkansas, and in the north, or in the West as well, California and the Pacific Northwest of Washington State and Oregon. He had numerous lumber interests throughout the country, again, like many of the other big lumbermen did in their day. Ward was well known, as I mentioned, in the lumber industry, and was well known in Michigan as well. He had quite a large estate in Orchard Lake, west of Pontiac, and that was kind of the family home for a number of years. And at his death, that became other uses, or after his wife had passed. But getting back to Deward here, there were stipulations that as it had to be liquidated in that 12 years. And we're talking millions of board feet of timber. I am being serenaded by coyotes. I don't know if you can hear that. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to be out here doing this broadcast. Maybe those are the ghosts of the ghost town of Deward. Nah, more likely they're coyotes. But so there were billions of board feet of lumber that could be, or that were standing in the trees there. A board foot being 1 square foot board by 1 inch thick. That was the standard measurement of lumber. And in a cut that opened up in 1907, so not even at the beginning of the lumber period, or of the Ward's period, there was, I need to look at that here. It was, I believe it was about 2.5 billion board feet. I'm looking at the wrong piece of information here. But so there was a large amount of standing lumber on there. One tree that was cut was called the Noble Big Pine. Now, this is coming from Carl Addison Leach, who wrote an article in 1944 for Michigan History Magazine, and it's kind of a romanticized article. But talking about this one particular pine, the amount of lumber that was scaled in this big log was 7,856 board feet. This log was 16-foot log, or long log, and it was, this tree itself was cut into 8 16-foot logs. So the diameter of this tree, it does not say, but it was huge. And generally these trees were cut to 16 feet long, and because they had lots of lumber in there. If that's 8 trees or 8 logs in that. Imagine though, the top end that did not get used. So you're looking at probably 160-foot log or tree or taller. So there was quite a bit of lumber that was cut in Deward. And it was all then milled in the Deward sawmill. And the mill operated on average 20 hours a day, 2 10-hour shifts, and there would be a break in between the shifts to change over of the crews. If they had to replace saw blades on there, the big bandsaw blades would dull very fast, so they would be replaced frequently so they could continue to cut without incident. And so they averaged about 200,000 board feet every 20 hours. And the record year had 52 million board feet that were cut at the mill. If you average that out to 200,000 by probably 363 days a year, they shut down on Christmas, and I believe they also did on Thanksgiving. So they were you're going to be cutting a lot of lumber there. Yeah, I don't have a calculator available at the moment to be able to check how much lumber that was cut. But it was definitely a very, very lucrative mill during its lifetime. We don't just talk about David Ward when we talk about Deward. He was, of course, the reason why the town existed. And it was his heirs who developed the town. But there were other people that lived in the community. There, in fact, David Ward, of course, was passed. His executors did not live in Deward. They had a superintendent who ran the town. There was a mill foreman who ran the sawmill. There was a superintendent of the railroad operations. And then there was also those that were involved with the operation of the camps. But the mill foreman was a man by the name of James Secord. And he was from Ohio originally, but had come to Michigan to work in lumber in the sawmills and rose to the height of being a mill foreman. First, he was up in Hardwood, up in Sheboygan County or Emmett County. And then he later came down to Deward in 1900 and oversaw the construction of the Deward mill. And his wife, Mabel Edwards Secord, was quite a documentarian of the life in Deward. She wrote or kept several journals, and thankfully much of them survive. I've been able to look at a transcript copy that's held at the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan. My particular favorite place for research, because they have a lot of information on Michigan's lumber industry there. But so I want to read about some of the things that she wrote about. As I've mentioned, that wildfires were pretty prevalent with the lumber industry and coming kind of hand in hand with the cutting. And one of those great fires that we had was in 1908, in the Metz fire up in Presque County, and it destroyed the town of Metz. Well, at the same time, there were numerous other fires that burned. One of them burned near Hartwick Pines, another one up here by Deward. It may have been part of the same fire, in fact, because that's not terribly far away. So this is what Mabel Secord wrote about the fire threatening Deward. October 16th, 1908. Metz burned yesterday. About 23 people lost their lives. It seems as though it is so dry it cannot rain. The hills southeast of town are all burning, and if the wind should change, the town would go. Fire in the woods is so bad that the mill shut down tonight, and every man that could handle a shovel was ordered to the woods tomorrow morning. October 17. 60 men left here on flat cars this morning. The Sand Lake tract of pine, estimated at 25 million board feet, is ablaze for 6 miles. The dead leaves burn like tinder. Frank Stewart was taken ill, and they carried him a mile to Charlie Ward's camp, where he was left with 5 men. The rest of our men returned about dusk. Cleary has been sending in camp supplies here by rail all day from Camp 11. About 10 p.m., Cleary phoned Mr. Schoaf, that Mr. Schoaf was the superintendent of Deward, of the Deward estate. Cleary phoned Mr. Schoaf that everything was out except hay, oats, and hogs. The fire was within 4 rods, which would be 64 feet, of camp, with flames running 40 feet high, and he was just leaving for Alba with 14 teams and 150 men. Alba is a town to the east or to the west of Deward. The receiver went up in a hurry, and we spent an anxious hour until word was received by phone from a farmhouse that they had reached the clearing in safety. They slept in a field. The hills back of the ball ground are a magnificent sight at night, but it is menacing beauty. The passenger train stayed here all night. They went as far as Mansalona Road. There was a cut there filled with dead leaves that looked like a yawning furnace door, and they dared not venture through it, so backed in here. October 18. The passenger went through to East Jordan. Car engine and 2 flat cars followed it to Lake Harold, which is southwest of Alba, where Cleary and his men met it and were brought here for breakfast. Tom Cornell went into Camp 11 on the velocipede and found everything burned except the barn. There was fire around it, but he managed to save it. When he went in the barn, he found the hogs had taken refuge there and were knee-deep in the onions, having the time of their lives. October 24, it began raining in the night and rained nearly all day. So the fires, which had practically burned themselves out, will surely die. So Mabel Secord shows that how dangerous fire was in the lumber period there. That's not really that's certainly not the only thing that she kept up on in her journals. She talked about here on March 25, 1909, Jim loosened a broken toggle chain on the dump. This was in the mill at 4:25 p.m. and the number 3 hook flew and struck him above the right eye through his heavy cap, knocking him down and landing 20 feet behind him. He got right up but was dizzy all night. He would later see the doctor, who diagnosed him with a concussion. This is my own added notes that I found. It would bother him for several weeks, including keeping him home from work for a number of days. Arthur Bedoin stepped into the bull wheel about 9 p.m. and lost part of his foot. So it was dangerous working in the mills. She talked about that. Here's something non-mill related, non-dangerous. June 20th, Mr. Parker, Jim, the children, and I went to Blue Lake in the automobile in the morning. Mr. Parker and Charles J. were here for dinner. The Blue Lake people were having trouble with the rigger and were found that they had their live steam pipe to their exhaust and vice versa. So going a little bit further back to April of 1906, April 9, school started again today. The night run began tonight. Chicago goods carry. Doesn't say what that means. It just stopped. May 12th, baked trout for dinner. Of course, they're right on the Manistee River, so it's a good trout stream. June 9th, 1906, the Swedish Ladies' Aid Society held their annual auction and supper at the hall. There was a large community hall located in the main community building of Deward. It was the company store and office on the lower level that also had the post office in it. The upper level was the community hall where they had dinners at during elections. That's where voting took place. And there was church services that could be held there. So this was certainly a real community that they had here in Deward. And many of the men had families. Those that were single men lived in the boarding house. Like I stated at the beginning, as a single man, that's where I would have been living at here in Deward. But they had a number of homes that could be rented. Of course, it was the rent was deducted from their pay. Not a 4-bedroom house. That's a little too palatial. A 4-room house cost $4 a month. A 5-room house cost, well, of course, $5 a month. Those were the typical homes that were available. And even the Secords, where James was the foreman and a fairly important man, they didn't have a very big house themselves. They had just one of the 5-room houses themselves. And there were some other houses, though, that were nicer. There was the estate house that was kind of the mansion there, and that's where all the official from the company or from the Ward estate would come stay at when they came up here. And in fact, Mabel Secord's parents were the caretakers of that house at one point. Her father was a retired sawmill man. In fact, how she and Jim met were because he worked with her father at the sawmill up in Sheboygan County, up north of Wolverine. So that was where, there was a nice community here. The superintendent, Mr. Schofer, he had a nice home here in Deward. The railroad superintendent had a nice home, but Jim was not white collar per se. He was kind of glorified blue collar employee. He ran the mill, but he was a skilled tradesman. He was not, one of the executives of the company, so he didn't live in that neighborhood of Deward. They were in kind of the main part of the community, along with many other people. Not only did they have, as I mentioned, the community hall that was in the main building, the store and office in there. There was a schoolhouse. Mabel Secord mentions about the children going back to school, April 9th. Not sure what the break was there, why they weren't in school prior to that. But there was also a church. There was a Swedish Lutheran church that doubled as other Protestant. The Catholics didn't have a Catholic church in Deward. They went to Frederick, to the church there, or there was a priest that would come sometimes and could preach in the community hall, along with some other denominations would do the same thing. But having that community hall, that was a nice place for parties at. They always had a big Thanksgiving dinner every year in the community. It would start the day with a community hunt. The men would go out hunting. And then when they came back, that would be the meal. They would eat some of what they hunted, what they killed during that day. So that was, and it was a contest to see who could get the biggest, the best, the most of whatever variety, whatever species they were hunting. Game laws in Michigan were very loose in the early 1900s. There was a concern with the game that if we would have enough, if it would survive, and so more game laws would start to happen. But out in the forest, in the logging camps and the lumber towns, it wasn't very far-reaching yet, the new rules in Michigan. So this was, as I mentioned, quite a community. And as I'm sitting here tonight, looking up at the sky, no stars out yet. It's kind of cloudy. But I can only imagine what it was like here 120 years ago, 1904, when Deward was not maybe at its height of activity here yet, but it was certainly happening. You had a town here of around, I don't know, it was a couple of hundred people living in town. It was considered the second largest community in Crawford County, Grayling being the largest, where the Salling-Hanson Company had their mills, and a few other sawmills were there, and it was the county seat. Frederick had been a booming community at times, but Deward was the center of logging at this point in this area. It was certainly the tail end of logging, and this was one of the last great tracts of pine land in the lower peninsula to be opened up for logging. And so it attracted quite a few people to work here. Some of them found great opportunity here. Some of them, it didn't quite work out. There was at one point that there was a strike at the sawmill. They had hired several Belgian laborers from Detroit and came up on the train. And down in Detroit, down there, they had been involved with the union, and they weren't happy up here. There was no union, and they chose to go on strike. Well, when you don't have a union behind you, and the labor laws aren't very strong at this time, the striking men were all fired. And Jim had told Mr. Schoaf, don't hire any more of the Belgians. And I don't think he was prejudiced against Belgians per se, as it was this group of men were very much, did not want to work under the conditions for the pay that was being offered in Deward. And that was certainly the case at this time, but this was also where the lumber industry, the jobs were tightening up. And, mill owners, lumbermen, they could get away with a lot of this because there was greater demand for or there was more men available than there were jobs. So if you didn't work out in your job, you were let go, usually without any type of compensation. Whatever wages were owed to you, that was it. And they were able to find somebody else. But this was also a transition in Michigan away from the lumber industry. Lumber was going down. We consider in Michigan 1910 as the end of our white pine lumber industry. Deward held on to 1912, so it outlasted what we call, quote unquote, the end of the era, though that's always a very fluid, depending on where you were. We look at it as the census. and where it was no longer one of the major employers in Michigan. But there was certainly the rise of other industries in our state. Shipping, maritime work was always involved, big in Michigan, being, the Great Lakes state. There was also the iron and copper mining up in the Upper Peninsula. They were still thriving quite a bit. And down in southern Michigan, there were a wide variety of industries. Grand Rapids had the furniture industry, which was based on the lumber industry. But Detroit, Flint, Saginaw, Lansing, Pontiac, and a number of other smaller communities were all got involved with the burgeoning automobile industry. And of course, we know what happened with that, particularly in Detroit. And it became the Motor City and was the automobile capital of the world at one point. So any men that were no longer working in the woods, working in the forest, if they didn't want to move on elsewhere in the lumber industry, many of them moved south, moved to Detroit or one of these other cities that had auto plants and started working there. Henry Ford certainly was a revolutionary when it came to paying wages for his men at $5 a day. Working in lumber and a lot of the other jobs were $1 a day. So he was, quadrupling or quintupling. Yeah, I can't say that. 5 times the amount of wages they were working in the woods, they could work in the auto industry. Now, of course, that varied in many ways. And we're not here talking about the auto industry. We're just kind of tying it in. But Deward, as I said, it eventually shut down. The 12 years was made. There was they were no longer going to log in this area, and James Secord was one of the men that stayed on in Deward after the shutdown because they had to dismantle the town, and that included the sawmill. Sometimes when they shut down industry, they just shut the mill down, locked it up, and walked away. Not so with Deward. I got something crawling on the tree behind me. In Deward, that mill was state of the art. They sold the mill. They sold it to a lumber company up in the Upper Peninsula, up in the little community of Sheldrake. And Sheldrake is located on Whitefish Bay in the eastern Upper Peninsula. If you're familiar with Tequamanon Falls State Park or the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point, driving north from Paradise up to the Whitefish Point, you pass through Sheldrake. And now all it is just a few houses there, a lot of people's summer cabins, cottages there on the lake, and where the highway there, or the road to Whitefish Point, crosses the Sheldrake River, which is not much of a river. It's a large stream, but it was big enough to provide water for the sawmill that was moved up from Deward. And it was in operation there, and I'm not sure exactly what they were cutting there. They could have still had some remnant white pine left, but they would have been cutting hardwood, I'm sure. And they were in operation there till about 1914, when unfortunately fire burnt down the sawmill. And fires and sawmills and lumber towns go hand in hand. As I mentioned with the Mabel Secord talking about the fires there near Deward, but they were always an endangerment to sawmills because you had all the dry sawdust, everything was made out of wood, and when it became very dry, usually was late summer, early fall if there wasn't much rain. So you have a lot of the serious fires in Michigan happened in September and October. But you get sparks from anything. It could be from railroad cars or the wheels on the tracks. It could be the various types of the sparks coming from smokestacks, but they catch something on fire and it smolders and then ignites and burns. And that was certainly something that was a concern. It didn't happen here in Deward, but it did happen to the mill after it moved out of here, moved to Sheldrake. So Deward, slowly everybody left here. As I mentioned, those who looked for other work, they went on right away. Those who stayed on for a little bit longer, like the Secords, they owned a farm up near East Jordan. So after this, they were done in Deward, they went up to East Jordan. They lived there, settled back onto their farm. And as far as I know, of what I've been able to research with Mabel Secord and James Secord, is they were farmers for the rest of James' life. He died in the 1920s, unfortunately, but Mabel Secord, she lived well into the 1970, or I think close to 1970. So she was quite elderly when she passed, and she had her children remained in the area there too, and in East Jordan. I need to get up and check out their graves at the cemetery there. And but it's very interesting of the different people that lived in Deward. There were others though who stayed. They bought the property from the Ward family and bought lots and lived here. The estate house was eventually purchased by others. I've read Rasmus Hansen, who was the president of the Salling Hansen Company, but the years don't jibe, so I'm not sure if that's a oral history that was passed down. But there was a family that lived out here that were caretakers of what they called the estate house, and they continued living in the area into the 1930s. And finally moved out of here. There's a couple of private property in holdings in the Deward area now. The majority of the land is state-owned. I am camping on state forest land tonight. And it likely became state land like much of the state forest land did. It was through tax... I can't speak now. It was through tax revision. And when reverted back to the state because the owners were not paying the taxes on the land anymore. And so that's how a lot of land became public here in Michigan once again. When you're a lumberman, if you are not needing that land anymore, using it, you're not going to pay taxes on it. Some of them did for a while, and then they found other uses for the land. But for much of it, they either tried to sell it, promoting it as agricultural land before they knew, and maybe even sometimes even though they knew that it was not good for agriculture. But otherwise, it went back to the state. Some of it became reforested, and others for other uses. The Deward Management Area, as this is officially called, there is some reforestation has happened here down by the sawmill site. There's a plantation of red pines in what was the mill yard, and where they had all of the lumber was stacked and dried before it was shipped out on the railroad. And but much of this land has been explored for oil and gas. Michigan sits on top of a fairly decent oil and gas reserve or underground, and we're not Oklahoma, we're not Texas or some of the other states, but we have oil and gas drilling that happens in northern Michigan. And there are wells scattered along here. The last time, in fact, I camped in the same location I'm at tonight, I heard through half the night a nearby derrick operating it. I don't know if it was oil or natural gas, but pumping it up out of the ground there, or not a derrick, but a pump. And it's not in operation, at least currently. Sometimes the wells go inactive for a while. They shut them down until they're more valuable to, to continue. But so that is oil and gas in this area. Limited logging. I've seen some areas where there are some recent cuts, but it's popular recreation. The Manistee River here, very popular fishing river, fly fishing for trout. Along with its sister river a few miles to the east, the Otsego River. We sit on the divide here between the Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. The Manistee River here flows into Lake Michigan at the town of Manistee, somewhere near 180 miles downstream. I believe, from here, because we're up near the very top, close to the headwaters of the river. And then just to the east here, just over on the other side of the ridge, are the streams, two small creeks that flow in together and create the headwaters of the Otsego River, and that flows to Lake Huron, about 120 miles of river to Lake Huron there, to Oscoda. But so this was an important area, as I mentioned. And it is great that it's preserved now as state land, as public land. There's fishing here, there's hunting here, camping, although there's no organized campsites. I'm doing what's called dispersed camping. There's a spot here, and it's been well used, and I've camped here a number of times previous. And it's just a nice, quiet place here. It's it's a very rustic, old-fashioned type of camping. Not in a organized campground. There's no electricity, no water. I have to bring in my own water. There's no toilets, so you get the picture. But it's very tranquil here. And I'll go for a walk here in a little bit, and hopefully we'll see if there's any Northern Lights activity tonight. It's been a very good summer and early fall for Northern Lights here in the North Country. So I would like to thank you all for sticking with me through this season of North Country history. It's had its ups and downs. This is the first time I've done anything like this. And some episodes have been smoother than others. Some have been a little rough. I'm, having my own growing pains. And I hope you all understand. The best thing about my podcast is that I have all of this knowledge that I have gained over, a couple of decades, more than 25 years now of working with forest history and environmental history. And since I'm not with a museum anymore, this is my outlet to share this history, to share this information to all of you. And it's been a great first season. And as I said, there's been the rough spots, but, we started out talking a bit about, setting up about why the forest here, why is it important here in the Great Lakes region? And of course, the main focus was with the lumber industry. That's where we really got, what was the focus for forest history here in Michigan and the Great Lakes for so many decades. And we went to further afield. We went into reforestation, the after effects of logging, the wildlife that was affected with by the forest, how important it is, the tie-in between the forest and wildlife, with my good friend, Craig Kasmer, my old colleague at Hartwick Pines, and he's still the park interpreter naturalist there. He certainly has been there quite a long time, longer than I served at Hartwick Pines, and he does a great job there. And then his counterpart, my successor, Hillary Pine, the historian at Hartwick Pines, and she's had such a great focus, has done research with on Karen Hartwick and just with the history of Hartwick Pines. I could have talked about that, but it's much more important to hear it from the current people there. So next year, we'll go further afield. I'm planning a trip out to Minnesota and Wisconsin next summer in 2025. So there'll be episodes at some point going to those other states that we've talked about. But also, we're going to go outside of the Great Lakes region. And actually, I'm recording this episode on October 3rd, October 4th of 2024. And I'm not sure what date this is airing because I don't have all of the schedule set up as of the recording date right now. But when you're listening to it, you'll know when it's airing. But in the next week, I'm going on a fall vacation from my bill-paying job. As I mentioned, I'm not working in museums right now. I have a regular day job to pay the bills. And but I'm going on vacation. I'm going to Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. And in Pennsylvania, I'm going to go to another one of the great old-growth forests that survive in the eastern United States. It's called Cook Forest State Park in northwestern Pennsylvania, and also going to the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum. I'm also going to head up into the Adirondack Mountains of New York, and the Adirondacks has no old growth. It was a completely logged area, but then they realized we need to save the rest of this as a park. And so it's the largest state park in the United States. It has towns and people living within that park. It's a different version of parks than what we have in Michigan. But so I'm going to explore some of that. And, these are places that will end up on podcasts. When I get to Vermont, it's going to be a drive-through day, the first leg going through there as I go to New Hampshire to visit with a friend, and then to Maine. But in Vermont, I hope to be stopping at the Marsh-Billings-Rockefeller National Historical Park. And it was a home of conservationists. I'm not going to know the first names right now, but Marsh and Billings and Rockefeller, yes, that Rockefeller family, all were leaders in conservation and saving the environment. And through the Billings period of ownership, they have a managed forest there that they created, and to kind of start to reforestation there in Vermont. I hope to maybe get into some of the Vermont maple syrup industry as well there, but time-wise, it's going to be an issue. New Hampshire, visiting a friend. Going to Maine, I'm going to Bangor. Bangor was the first great lumber town in the United States, and going to go see some lumber history along in that area. And then on the return route, I might not be hitting any other type of historical spots, but these will end up in the podcast. I'll be going to the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. Baseball's my other love besides environmental history, but not going to be in the podcast. But anyway, so thank you so much for listening for this first season, and there'll be a gap in time before the next season begins. That will give me time to record new episodes, and just thanks you for listening. And as always, if you enjoyed this, please tell a friend and check out everything, how I'm trying to carry this forward. I have my YouTube channel, and yes, it is called North Country History. I have my Facebook page, my public page. Currently, it is known as Rob Berg Environmental Historian. And that's where I kind of keep up with all sorts of environmental history topics. But there's links there to the podcast and to other information. I'm on Instagram, North Country History. Along with that, a Threads account. So those are the ways you can kind of follow along. A website is in the works. Don't have it up yet, but it will be eventually. Maybe by season 2. Maybe for sure season 3. So thank you again. And until the next season, have a great time. Enjoy the forest. Get out there. Explore. And please contact me through any of the channels, any of the modes, if you want more information. Thank you. North Country History with Rob Berg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Berg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Berg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Berg Environmental Historian.